Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, I'm sharing some stories that will probably make you rethink a lot of things about trust, family, and the choices people make when they think no one is watching. These are the kind of stories that stay with you long after you've heard them. The kind that make you grateful for the people in your life who actually care, or make you realize why some people shouldn't be in your life at all. Before we get into it, I just want to thank you all for being here. Whether you're trying to fall asleep, escape from a rough day, or just need something to listen to while the world feels a bit too heavy, I'm glad you're here. Grab something comfortable, maybe a warm drink, and let's dive into these stories together. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that the person they trusted most had been living a completely different life behind their back. This isn't just about cheating, it's about something far more calculated, far more cruel. I'm 32 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I'd been with my husband Marcus for 8 years, married for 5. We met at work, both of us climbing the corporate ladder at the same tech company. He was charming, ambitious, and he made me feel like I was the center of his world. Everyone told us we were the perfect couple. Even I believed it. We had this routine down to a science. Every morning, we'd have coffee together before heading to the office. Every Friday night was date night, no exceptions. We'd talk about our future, about the house we'd buy, about maybe having kids in a few years once we'd both made partner. It all felt so solid, so real. Looking back now, I realize how carefully he maintained that illusion, how calculated every gesture was, how he knew exactly what to say to keep me believing in the fantasy he'd constructed. The cracks started showing in small ways. He began working late more often, which wasn't unusual in our industry, but the pattern changed. Before, he'd text me throughout the evening, complaining about his workload, asking what I wanted for dinner when he got home. But those messages stopped. When he did come home, he was distant, distracted. He'd say he was exhausted and go straight to bed. I told myself it was just stress. We were both up for promotions, and the pressure was intense. I gave him space because I thought that's what he needed. I was so focused on being understanding, on being the supportive wife, that I didn't see what was actually happening. Then came the weekend that changed everything. Marcus told me he had to fly to Chicago for a client meeting, said he'd be gone from Friday morning until Sunday night. This was normal for his role, so I didn't question it. I even drove him to the airport, kissed him goodbye, told him I loved him. That same afternoon, I got a call from my friend Sarah. She sounded strange on the phone, asked if I could meet her for coffee urgently. Something in her voice made my stomach drop. I knew whatever she had to tell me was going to hurt. We met at our usual place, a quiet coffee shop near my apartment. Sarah looked uncomfortable, kept fidgeting with her cup, avoiding eye contact. Finally, she took out her phone and showed me a series of photos. They were from Instagram, posted by someone I didn't recognize. But in every single photo, there was Marcus. He was at a restaurant I'd never been to. He was at someone's apartment. He was at a birthday party. And in every single photo, he had his arm around a woman I'd never seen before. Not in a friendly way. In the way you hold someone you're intimate with. Someone you love. Sarah told me the woman's name was Elena. She was a consultant who'd started working with our company about a year ago. Sarah had seen them together a few times at work events I hadn't attended, but she'd assumed Elena was just a colleague, until she saw these photos, until she saw the way Marcus looked at her. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Sarah kept apologizing, saying she didn't know if she should tell me, but she couldn't keep it from me anymore. I thanked her, told her she did the right thing, and then I sat there in that coffee shop for what felt like hours, staring at those photos. Marcus wasn't in Chicago. He was 20 minutes away, living a completely separate life with another woman. I went home and did something I'd never done before. I went through his things, his computer, his drawers, his wallet when he wasn't looking, and I found evidence of an entire relationship I knew nothing about. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges from places we'd never been to together, text messages that went back months, talking about their plans, their future, how much they loved each other. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was how long he'd been doing it, how good he was at lying, how he could kiss me goodbye in the morning and spend the evening with her, then come home and tell me about his day like nothing was wrong. I found emails between them talking about me. Elena knew I existed. She knew Marcus was married. In one email, she wrote about how she understood it was complicated, how she was patient, how she'd wait for him to figure out how to leave me. Marcus's response made me feel sick. He wrote about how he cared about me but wasn't in love with me anymore, how he'd been trying to find the right time to end things, how he appreciated her patience. He'd been planning to leave me. He was just waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, I was planning our future, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd already written me out of his. When Marcus came home on Sunday night, I was waiting for him. I'd had 2 days to prepare, 2 days to decide what I wanted to say. I'd printed out some of the photos, the emails, the receipts. I laid them all out on our kitchen table. He walked in, saw what I'd found, and his face went pale. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he tried to explain. Tried to tell me it wasn't what it looked like, that he could explain everything. But I stopped him. I told him I didn't want to hear his excuses. I didn't want his apologies. I asked him one question. How long had he been planning to leave me without telling me? How long was he going to let me believe we had a future together while he built a life with someone else? He couldn't answer. He just stood there, looking at the floor, his hands in his pockets. Finally, he said he didn't know. He said he was confused, that he cared about both of us, that he didn't mean for it to happen this way. That's when I realized something important. He wasn't sorry he'd done it. He was sorry he got caught. He was upset that his carefully managed double life had fallen apart, not because he'd hurt me, but because now he had to deal with the consequences. I told him to leave, to go to Elena's place, since that's clearly where he wanted to be. He tried to argue, said we should talk about this, that we could work through it. But I was done talking. I'd spent 8 years of my life with someone who'd been lying to me for the past year, maybe longer. I deserved better than that. Marcus moved out that week. The divorce papers came a few months later. Our mutual friends were shocked. Everyone had thought we were so happy, so stable, and I'd thought so too. That was the hardest part. Realizing that I'd been living in a fantasy, that the person I thought I knew didn't actually exist. I found out later that Marcus and Elena are still together. They moved in together pretty quickly after he left. Part of me wonders if he tells her the truth about things, or if he's still the same person who could lie so easily, so convincingly. Maybe she'll find out someday, the way I did. Maybe she already knows and just doesn't care. The experience taught me something valuable, though. Trust isn't just about believing someone. It's about paying attention to the small things, the inconsistencies, the moments when something doesn't quite add up. I'd ignored those warning signs because I wanted to believe everything was fine. Because it was easier than facing the truth. Now I'm more careful, not paranoid, just aware. I pay attention to actions, not just words, because people will tell you anything you want to hear, but what they do when they think you're not looking, that's who they really are. Marcus showed me exactly who he was, and I'm grateful I found out when I did, before we bought that house, before we had kids, before I invested any more of my life into someone who didn't value what we had. That story always gets me. The way people can compartmentalize their lives, living completely separate realities depending on who's watching. It makes you wonder how many people are doing exactly that. How many seemingly perfect relationships are actually built on carefully maintained lies. Speaking of carefully maintained lies, our next story is about someone who discovered their entire family had been keeping a secret from them for decades. The kind of secret that changes everything you thought you knew about yourself. I'm 41 years old, and 3 years ago, I found out that my entire childhood was based on a lie. Not a small lie, not the kind of white lie parents tell to protect their kids. A massive, life-altering lie that everyone in my family had agreed to keep from me. I grew up believing that my parents, Robert and Linda, were my biological parents. I had no reason to think otherwise. I looked like them, or at least I thought I did. We had family traditions, inside jokes, all the normal things that families have. My childhood wasn't perfect, but it was mine. My mum passed away when I was 37. It was sudden, a heart attack that took her before any of us could process what was happening. The grief was overwhelming. She'd been my best friend. the person I called when anything significant happened in my life. Losing her felt like losing a part of myself. After the funeral, my dad asked me to help him sort through her belongings. It was a difficult task, going through her clothes, her jewellery, her personal items. Each thing we found brought back memories, made the loss feel fresh all over again. I was going through a box of old documents in her closet when I found an envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was my mother's, but it looked shaky, uncertain. Inside was a letter dated from 5 years before she died. It started with the words that would change my life forever. "My dearest child, there's something I need to tell you about where you came from." The letter explained that I was adopted, not through an agency, not through any official channels. I was the child of my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Carol. She'd gotten pregnant at 16, and the family had been devastated. This was the early 1980s in a small conservative town where teenage pregnancy was seen as a massive scandal. My grandparents and my mother came up with a plan. My mother, who had been trying to have children for years without success, would claim the pregnancy as her own. She wore padding, they avoided social situations for months, and when Carol gave birth, my mother and father took me home as their own child. Carol went away to college shortly after, built a new life for herself, and eventually got married and had 2 other children. I'd grown up knowing her as my fun aunt who visited on holidays and sent birthday cards. She'd been at my graduation, my wedding, every important moment in my life, and the entire time she'd been my biological mother. The letter went on to explain that everyone knew. My father, my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles. Even Carol's husband knew. The only person who didn't know was me. My mother wrote that she'd meant to tell me so many times, that she'd written this letter as a way to finally admit the truth, but she could never bring herself to actually give it to me. I sat on the floor of that closet, reading and rereading the letter, trying to process what I was learning. My entire identity was a fabrication. The woman I'd called Mum my whole life wasn't my biological mother. The woman I'd called Aunt Carol, who I'd spent holidays with, who I'd laughed with and confided in, had given birth to me and then pretended to be something else for my entire life. I went to my father immediately. I was angry, confused, hurt. I demanded answers. He looked at the letter in my hands and his face crumbled. He started crying, something I'd only seen him do once before, at my mother's funeral. He confirmed everything in the letter and then some. He told me that my biological father was someone Carol had dated briefly in high school. They'd broken up before she even knew she was pregnant, and he'd moved away for college. Carol never told him. She made the decision to give me to her sister because she knew she couldn't raise a child at 16. She wanted me to have a stable home, 2 parents, a better life than she could provide at that age. My parents had raised me as their own because they loved me, because they'd wanted a child so desperately, and I was a gift they never expected. They'd kept the secret because they thought it was what was best for me, because they didn't want me to feel different, to feel like I didn't fully belong to our family. But in keeping that secret, they'd taken away my right to know my own history. They'd let me build relationships with people under false pretenses. Every interaction I'd ever had with Carol was now coloured by this new information. Had she looked at me and seen her son? Had it hurt her to hear me call someone else Mum? Or had she made peace with her decision so completely that she truly saw me as her nephew and nothing more? I called Carol. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. She answered cheerfully, like she always did, asking how I was handling my mother's loss. I told her I'd found the letter. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she started crying. She apologized over and over, said she'd wanted to tell me so many times. She explained that she was just a scared kid when she got pregnant. That giving me to her sister seemed like the best option for everyone involved. She'd watched me grow up, been part of my life, but always from a distance that she'd agreed to maintain. She told me that seeing me happy, seeing me loved and cared for by her sister, had helped her make peace with her decision. She'd built her own family, had her own children, but she'd never stopped thinking about me, never stopped wondering what might have been different if she'd kept me. We met in person a few weeks later. It was awkward and emotional. We both cried a lot. She told me about my biological father, a guy named David who she dated for a few months in high school. She'd tried to find him years ago, out of curiosity, but he'd moved overseas and she'd lost track of him. Meeting Carol as my biological mother instead of my aunt was surreal. I saw features in her face that matched mine, things I'd never noticed before. The shape of her eyes, the way she smiled, the way her hands moved when she talked. These were things I'd inherited from her, not from the people I'd always thought were my genetic parents. The hardest part was reconciling my feelings about all of this. I wasn't angry at Carol for giving me up. She was 16 years old. She made what she thought was the best decision at the time. But I was angry at the adults who'd kept this from me for 41 years, who'd let me build my entire life on a foundation that wasn't real. I was angry at my mother for writing that letter and then never giving it to me, for carrying this secret until she died, leaving me to find it in a box of old documents like it was just another piece of forgotten paperwork. I was angry at my father for going along with it, for looking at me every day and never once suggesting that maybe I deserved to know the truth. And I was angry at myself for never questioning it, for never noticing the small inconsistencies, for accepting everything at face value because it was easier than asking difficult questions. The revelation affected everything. My relationship with my father became strained. I couldn't look at him without thinking about all the times he could have told me and chose not to. He'd kept this secret through my entire childhood, through my teenage years, through my 20s and 30s. At what point does protecting someone cross the line into controlling their life? My relationship with Carol became complicated in a different way. She wanted to build something new with me, wanted me to get to know her as more than just an aunt, but I didn't know how to do that. She'd made her choice 41 years ago, and I respected that choice, but now she wanted to change the terms of our relationship, and I wasn't sure I could give her what she wanted. My half-siblings, Carol's other children, had known the truth for years. They'd known I was their half-brother and had kept it from me at family gatherings, at weddings, at funerals. Every interaction I'd had with them was now tainted by the knowledge that they'd all been part of this massive deception. I started therapy to work through my feelings. My therapist helped me understand that everyone involved had made choices based on what they thought was right at the time. That doesn't make it okay, but it provides context. My mother and father had wanted to give me a normal childhood, free from the stigma of being adopted or feeling different. Carol had been a child herself, making an impossible decision with limited options. But understanding their motivations didn't erase my anger or my grief. I grieved for the relationship I could have had with Carol if I'd known the truth earlier. I grieved for the honest relationship I could have had with my parents if they'd trusted me with this information. I grieve for the person I thought I was, because that person didn't exist anymore. 3 years later, I'm still processing all of this. I've reached a kind of uneasy peace with the situation. I understand why people made the choices they made, even if I don't agree with them. I've accepted that my family history is more complicated than I thought, and that's okay. Carol and I have built something new. It's not a traditional mother-son relationship, and it never will be, but we talk regularly. We see each other for holidays, and I've gotten to know her in a way I never did before. She's answered all my questions about my biological father, about her pregnancy, about the decision to give me up. Some of those conversations have been painful, but they've also been necessary. My father and I are working on our relationship. It's been hard. There are days when I look at him and all I can think about is how he lied to me for decades. But he's still my dad. He raised me, loved me, taught me how to be a man. That doesn't disappear just because we're not biologically related. The biggest lesson I've learned from all of this is that family is complicated. It's messy and imperfect, and sometimes built on foundations that aren't as solid as we think. But that doesn't make the love any less real. My parents loved me, raised me, gave me everything they could. Carol made an impossible choice at 16, and then watched from the sidelines as I grew up. Everyone did the best they could with the information and resources they had at the time. That doesn't make their choices right, but it makes them human. And maybe that's all any of us can be. Just humans trying to make the best decisions we can with imperfect information and complicated emotions. I still wish they'd told me sooner. I wish I'd had the chance to process this information when my mother was still alive, so I could have asked her questions and understood her perspective. But I can't change the past. All I can do is move forward with the knowledge I have now and build relationships based on honesty and truth. Because if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that secrets have a way of coming out eventually. And when they do, they leave damage in their wake. Better to be honest from the beginning, even when it's hard, than to build a life on lies and hope they never catch up with you. That story hits differently when you think about all the families out there keeping similar secrets. How many people are living with knowledge about their relatives that those relatives don't have about themselves? How many carefully constructed narratives are one letter away from falling apart? Let's shift gears a bit with our next story. This one is about revenge, but not the dramatic movie kind. This is about the slow, calculated kind of revenge that takes patience and planning. I'm 35 years old, and I spent 3 years planning revenge on someone who destroyed my career. I know that sounds dramatic, maybe even petty. But when you've worked your entire adult life to build something, and someone tears it down out of jealousy and spite, sometimes revenge is the only thing that makes sense. 10 years ago, I started a small marketing agency with my business partner, someone I'll call Derek. We'd met in college, both business majors with big dreams and bigger ambitions. We worked well together. I was creative, good with clients, excellent at coming up with campaigns. Derek was analytical, great with numbers, skilled at the business side of things. For the first few years, things were perfect. We grew the agency slowly but steadily, taking on bigger clients, hiring talented people, building a reputation in our city. We weren't making millions, but we were doing well. More importantly, we were doing what we loved. Then Derek got married. His wife, Amanda, started inserting herself into the business. At first, it was small things. She'd stop by the office, offer suggestions on projects she knew nothing about, try to attend client meetings. Derek thought it was cute that she was interested in his work. I found it irritating but tried to be understanding. Amanda was insecure and competitive in a way that became more apparent over time. She'd studied marketing in college but had never successfully built a career in it. I think our agency's success bothered her because it was something Derek and I had built together, something she wasn't part of. She started planting seeds of doubt in Derek's mind. I'd hear them arguing in his office. She'd suggest that I wasn't pulling my weight, that I was taking credit for work the team was doing, that Derek was doing all the real work while I coasted on my client relationships. None of this was true, but Amanda was persistent. Derek started changing. He became distant, questioned my decisions, undermined me in meetings. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd gotten defensive, said I was being paranoid, that Amanda was just trying to help, that I should appreciate her input. Things came to a head 3 years after Derek got married. I arrived at the office one Monday morning to find the locks changed. I called Derek, confused, thinking maybe there'd been a security issue. He told me to come to the lawyer's office downtown. When I got there, I found Derek, Amanda, and a lawyer I'd never met before. They prepared paperwork to buy me out of the company. Not at market value, not even at a fair price. They were offering me barely enough to cover my initial investment from 10 years ago, claiming that Derek had done most of the real work and that my contributions weren't as valuable as I thought. I was stunned. This was my company too. I'd built it from nothing, spent countless hours developing client relationships, creating campaigns, growing our reputation, and now Derek, with Amanda whispering in his ear, was trying to push me out for pennies on the dollar. I refused their offer. I told Derek that if he wanted me out, we'd need to do this properly, with real valuations and fair compensation. He said fine, we'd go through arbitration. But he warned me that he had documented evidence that I'd been mismanaging funds, stealing clients, all kinds of accusations that were completely fabricated. That's when I realized what had happened. Amanda had spent months building a case against me. She'd taken emails out of context, twisted normal business dealings into evidence of wrongdoing, created a narrative where I was the villain and Derek was the victim. The arbitration process was a nightmare. It dragged on for 8 months. Amanda had coached Derek on what to say, had prepared documents that made me look incompetent and dishonest. She'd even convinced some of our employees to testify against me, promising them promotions and raises if they backed Derek's version of events. In the end, I lost. The arbitrator determined that while I'd contributed significantly to the company's early success, Derek had been the primary driver of our growth in recent years. I was bought out for about 30% of what my share was actually worth. The company I'd helped build from nothing was taken from me, and I walked away with barely enough money to cover my legal fees. I was devastated. I'd lost my business, my financial security, and my best friend all at once. Derek wouldn't even speak to me after the arbitration. He'd fully bought into Amanda's narrative that I was a parasite who'd been holding him back. For a few months, I fell apart. I couldn't find work because Derek and Amanda had spread rumours about me in our industry. Potential clients were told I was difficult to work with, that I'd stolen from my previous partner, that I couldn't be trusted. My reputation was destroyed. But eventually, the grief turned into something else. Anger, then determination. If Derek and Amanda wanted to destroy me, I'd make sure they understood the consequences of that choice. I started small. I began documenting everything I could find about their business practices. I reached out to former employees who'd left the agency, people who'd seen firsthand how Amanda manipulated situations and how Derek went along with it. Many of them were angry about how things had gone down, and they were willing to share information. I discovered that Amanda had been doing more than just pushing me out. She'd been using company funds for personal expenses, disguising them as business costs. She'd been falsifying reports to clients, claiming results that didn't exist. She'd been creating a house of cards, and Derek was either oblivious or complicit. I spent a year gathering evidence, bank statements, emails, testimony from former employees and vendors. I documented everything meticulously, made copies of everything, stored it all securely. I wanted to make sure that when I finally acted, I had an airtight case. Then I waited. I wanted Derek and Amanda to feel secure, to think they'd gotten away with it. I wanted them to expand the company, take on bigger clients, make bigger promises, because the higher they climbed, the harder they'd fall. 2 years after they'd pushed me out, the agency landed their biggest client yet, a major retail chain that was investing millions in a marketing campaign. It was the kind of account that could transform a small agency into a major player. Derek and Amanda were thrilled. They gave interviews to local business magazines, talking about their success and their vision for the future. That's when I made my move. I sent my evidence to several people. First, to the tax authorities, showing them how Amanda had been misappropriating company funds and failing to report personal expenses as income. Second, to their biggest clients, showing them the falsified reports and the evidence that the results they'd been promised were fabricated. Third, to the local business reporter who'd done a glowing profile on Derek and Amanda, giving him a much more interesting story to write. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The tax authorities launched an investigation. Clients started pulling their accounts, demanding audits of their campaigns. The reporter wrote a scathing follow-up article about fraud in the local marketing industry, naming Derek and Amanda's agency as a case study. Within 3 months, the agency was in freefall. They lost half their clients. The major retail account pulled out immediately, citing concerns about business ethics. The tax penalties alone were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Derek and Amanda had to sell their house to pay the fines and legal fees. But I wasn't done. I reached out to every client they'd lied to and offered my services as a consultant to help them audit their previous campaigns and determine what results were real and what had been fabricated. Many of them hired me, grateful to have someone who could untangle the mess Derek and Amanda had created. Within a year, I'd rebuilt my reputation and started a new agency. Many of the employees who'd left Derek and Amanda's sinking ship came to work for me, bringing inside knowledge and client contacts. Some of the clients I'd worked with during the audits became clients of my new agency. Derek's agency limped along for another year before finally closing. They declared bankruptcy, lost everything they'd built. I heard through industry contacts that Derek and Amanda got divorced. Apparently, once the money and success were gone, there wasn't much left holding them together. Last I heard, Derek was working for someone else's agency in a junior position. Amanda had left the industry entirely. The empire they'd built on lies and betrayal had crumbled, and they were left with nothing. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy watching them fall. After what they'd done to me, after the way they'd tried to destroy my career and reputation, seeing them face consequences for their actions was satisfying in a way few things have been. But here's the thing I learned from all of this. Revenge doesn't actually make you feel better in the long run. In the moment, yes. Watching them scramble as their world fell apart was gratifying. But once it was over, I was left with the same anger and hurt I'd started with. What actually helped was building something new, creating a better agency than the one I'd lost, surrounding myself with people who shared my values and work ethic, proving to myself and others that I could succeed on my own terms. The revenge was just the period at the end of a sentence. The real story was everything that came after, building a life and a business that were better than what I'd had before. Learning from the experience and becoming more careful about who I trusted. Understanding that success isn't just about making money or gaining clients, but about doing business in a way you can be proud of. Derek and Amanda taught me an important lesson, even if they didn't mean to. They showed me what happens when you prioritize short-term gains over long-term integrity. When you lie and cheat and manipulate to get ahead, eventually it all catches up with you. The house of cards collapses, and when it does, there's no one left to help you because you've burned every bridge on your way up. I could have handled things differently. I could have let it go, moved on without seeking revenge. Maybe that would have been the more mature choice, but I'm not sure I regret the path I took. They tried to destroy me, and instead they destroyed themselves. And I got to watch. That story about revenge fascinates me because it shows how patient some people can be. 3 years of planning, of waiting for the right moment. That takes a kind of dedication that most people don't have. Whether it was justified or just petty, I'll leave for you to decide. Let's talk about something different now. Our next story is about someone who made a choice that seemed small at the time, but ended up having massive consequences they never could have predicted. I'm 29 years old, and I made a decision 5 years ago that saved someone's life. I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was just doing a small kindness, the kind of thing most people would do without thinking twice, but that choice created a ripple effect that changed multiple lives, including my own. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. I remember because it was cold and starting to snow, and I was running late for a meeting. I was rushing out of a coffee shop when I noticed a woman sitting alone at a corner table. She looked young, maybe early 20s, and she was crying, not the quiet, trying to hide it kind of crying, full-on sobbing with her head in her hands. My first instinct was to keep walking. I was late. I didn't know her, and getting involved in a stranger's problems wasn't something I normally did. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the way she looked so completely alone in a crowded coffee shop. Maybe it was because she reminded me of my younger sister. Whatever the reason, I walked over to her table. I asked if she was okay, if there was anything I could do to help. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and shook her head, said she was fine, just having a bad day. But she didn't sound fine. She sounded like someone who'd reached the end of their rope. I sat down anyway. Told her my name was Jake and that I had a few minutes if she wanted to talk. She looked surprised, like she couldn't believe a stranger would care enough to stop. Then she started talking. Her name was Emma. She was 22 years old, a college dropout working 2 jobs and barely making enough to survive. She'd just been evicted from her apartment because she couldn't make rent. Everything she owned was in her car, parked outside. She had no family in the area, no friends she felt comfortable asking for help. She felt completely alone and didn't know what to do next. As she talked, I realized this wasn't just about losing her apartment. Emma was in a dark place mentally. She kept saying things like how everyone would be better off without her, how she was tired of fighting just to survive. I recognized those statements for what they were, warning signs. I stayed and listened. I missed my meeting completely and didn't care. I bought us both coffee and let her talk for over an hour. She told me about dropping out of college due to financial problems, about family issues that had left her estranged from her parents, about a series of setbacks and bad luck that had brought her to this breaking point. When she finally stopped talking, I did something I'd never done before. I offered to help her. I had a spare room in my apartment that I wasn't using. I told her she could stay there temporarily, just until she got back on her feet. No expectations, no strings attached. Just a safe place to sleep and figure out her next steps. Emma looked at me like I was crazy, asked why I would do that for a complete stranger. I didn't have a good answer. I just knew that she needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. And maybe if I'd been in her situation, I'd want someone to do the same for me. She moved into my spare room that evening. I helped her bring her stuff up from her car, which wasn't much. A few bags of clothes, some books, a laptop. Everything she owned fit in the corner of my guest room. For the first few days, Emma was quiet and withdrawn. She'd stay in her room most of the time, only coming out to eat or use the bathroom. I gave her space, let her process whatever she was going through. But I also made a point of checking in on her regularly, making sure she had what she needed. Gradually, she started opening up. We'd have dinner together and talk about her situation. I helped her update her resume and apply for better jobs. I connected her with a therapist I knew who offered sliding scale fees. I introduced her to some of my friends, helped her build a support system in the city. Slowly, Emma started to recover. She got a better job, started therapy, began rebuilding her life. She moved out of my apartment after 3 months, but we stayed in touch. She'd text me updates about her progress, thank me for giving her a chance when she'd needed it most. About a year after we met, Emma told me something I didn't know. The day I found her crying in that coffee shop, she'd been planning to end her life. She'd written notes, made arrangements, decided the evening would be her last, but then I sat down and talked to her, showed her that someone cared, that there were people in the world who would help without expecting anything in return. That conversation gave her a reason to keep going for one more day, then another. When she told me this, I was shaken. I'd had no idea how close she'd been to the edge. If I'd walked past her that day, if I'd been too busy or too uncomfortable to stop, she might not be alive. That realization was overwhelming. Emma went on to finish her degree. She got into a good graduate program, started building the life she'd always wanted. She got married last year to someone she met through mutual friends. At her wedding, she gave a speech about how one act of kindness from a stranger changed her life trajectory completely. But that's not where the story ends. Emma's recovery had ripple effects I never anticipated. Her younger brother had been struggling with similar mental health issues. Seeing his sister get help and rebuild her life inspired him to seek treatment too. Her parents, who'd been estranged from both their kids, started going to family therapy. The whole family began healing together. Emma now volunteers at a crisis hotline, helping people who are in the same dark place she once was. She's planning to become a therapist, specializing in helping young adults in crisis. She's turned her own experience into a mission to help others. And it all started because I was willing to be 10 minutes late to a meeting to talk to a crying stranger in a coffee shop. I think about that day a lot, about how easy it would have been to walk past, to assume someone else would help, to prioritize my own schedule over someone else's obvious pain. And I think about all the people we pass every day who might be in that same dark place, silently hoping someone will notice and care enough to stop. Emma and I are still friends. We don't talk every day, but we stay in touch. Every year, on the anniversary of the day we met, she sends me a message thanking me for saving her life. And every year, I tell her that she saved herself. I just happened to be there at the right moment. But in a way, that experience saved me too. Before I met Emma, I was going through the motions of life without really engaging with the world around me. I was focused on my career, my goals, my own problems. I didn't think much about the people around me or the impact I could have on their lives. Emma taught me that small acts of kindness matter more than we realize, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just show up for someone, even if you don't know them, even if it's inconvenient, even if you're not sure what to say or how to help. Sometimes just being present is enough. I'm more attentive now to the people around me. I notice when someone seems off, when they're struggling, and I make a point of checking in, even if it's awkward, even if I'm not sure it will make a difference, because maybe it will. Maybe that small gesture will be exactly what someone needs to keep going for one more day. The other thing I learned is that we never really know what people are going through. Emma looked like a typical college-age kid having a bad day. There was no way to know from looking at her how close she was to ending her life. People are incredibly good at hiding their pain, at putting on a functional face even when they're falling apart inside. That's why it's so important to be kind to everyone, even strangers. You never know what battle they're fighting. You never know when a simple gesture of compassion might be the thing that makes the difference between someone giving up and someone deciding to keep trying. Emma's story also taught me about resilience, how people can come back from the darkest places if they have support and resources, how, with the right help at the right time, someone can completely change the trajectory of their life. I'm not a hero. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stopped and listened when someone needed it. But that simple act had consequences that neither of us could have predicted. It changed Emma's life, which changed her family's lives, which changed the lives of the people she's helped through her volunteer work. One choice. One moment of deciding to be present instead of walking past. That's all it took to start a cascade of positive changes that are still rippling outward years later. So, I guess the lesson is this. Pay attention. Be present. If you see someone who needs help, help them if you can. You might save a life. You might change the course of someone's entire future. And you might discover, as I did, that in helping someone else, you end up helping yourself too. That story always reminds me that we have more power than we realize to affect the lives of the people around us, both positively and negatively. Every interaction, every choice, every moment of deciding whether to engage or walk past, it all matters more than we think. Let's move on to something that's a bit darker. This next story is about someone who discovered that their best friend wasn't who they thought at all. I'm 38 years old, and 2 years ago I discovered that my best friend since childhood had been systematically lying to me about almost everything for over 20 years. Not small lies. Massive, elaborate fabrications that required constant maintenance and incredible attention to detail. I met Tom when we were 7 years old. We were in the same second grade class, both shy kids who didn't have many friends. We bonded over comic books and video games, spent countless hours at each other's houses, became inseparable. As we grew up, we stayed close. We went to different colleges but talked regularly, visited each other whenever we could, maintained the kind of friendship people describe as being like brothers. Tom always had interesting stories to tell. He travelled to amazing places, had exciting jobs, dated beautiful women. His life seemed charmed in a way that mine wasn't, but I was happy for him. I thought he deserved good things. Looking back, there were signs that something was off, small inconsistencies in his stories, times when he'd tell me about a trip he'd taken, and later details would change. Dates that didn't quite line up, photos that seemed oddly generic, like they could have been taken anywhere. But I never questioned it because Tom was my best friend. I trusted him completely. Why would he lie to me? What reason could he possibly have to make up stories about his life? The truth started unraveling 2 years ago when Tom told me he was getting married. He was excited, told me all about his fiancée Sarah, how they'd met, how perfect she was. He asked me to be his best man and I was honoured. We started planning the bachelor party, making arrangements for the wedding. I was genuinely happy for him. Then, about 2 months before the wedding, I got a strange message on social media. It was from a woman claiming to be Tom's sister. I was confused because Tom had told me he was an only child. The message said she needed to talk to me urgently about my friend Tom. We spoke on the phone that evening. This woman, whose name was actually Sarah, told me a story that seemed impossible. She said Tom had been pretending to be someone else online for years, that he'd created an entire fake persona, complete with a fake job, fake travels, even a fake fiancée. The wedding he'd been planning didn't exist. His fiancée Sarah wasn't real. I didn't believe her at first. I thought she was some kind of scam artist or someone with a grudge against Tom. But she sent me evidence. Screenshots of Tom's social media profiles where he'd posted photos claiming to be in places he'd never been. Records showing that the company he claimed to work for had never employed him. Proof that the apartment he'd told me he lived in was actually owned by someone else entirely. I confronted Tom. At first, he denied everything, said this woman was lying, that she was trying to break up our friendship for some reason, but when I showed him the evidence, his face changed. The confident, successful friend I thought I knew crumbled in front of me. He admitted that he'd been lying to me for years, about almost everything. The prestigious job he claimed to have, he actually worked at a call centre, the amazing apartment downtown. He lived with roommates in a cheap place on the outskirts of the city. The exotic trips, He'd found the photos online and pretended they were his own. The fiancée? Completely made up. I asked him why. Why would he maintain such an elaborate lie for so long? What was the point? Tom broke down crying. He said he'd started lying in college because he was ashamed of his actual life. He'd felt like he was falling behind, like everyone else was succeeding while he struggled. So he started embellishing things, making his life sound better than it was. What started as small exaggerations grew into elaborate fabrications. He'd created fake social media accounts to support his stories, photoshopped himself into pictures, learned enough details about places he'd never been to convincingly talk about them. The more he lied, the harder it became to stop, because admitting the truth would mean confessing to years of deception. He said he'd been planning to actually get married to someone, anyone, just to make the lie real, but he couldn't find anyone willing to marry him on such short notice, and the whole thing was falling apart. He was in debt from trying to maintain appearances, depressed from living a double life, desperate to come clean, but terrified of losing the one genuine friendship he had left. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt sorry for him. He was clearly suffering, clearly in pain from carrying all these lies. But another part of me was angry. He'd lied to me for over 20 years. Every conversation we'd had, every story he'd told, it had all been built on fabrications. I didn't even know who the real Tom was because he'd spent so long pretending to be someone else. I told him I needed time to process everything. I left and didn't talk to him for several months. During that time, I went through our entire friendship in my mind, trying to figure out what had been real and what had been fake. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where most of the pieces didn't actually fit together. Eventually, Tom reached out again. He'd been in therapy, working on understanding why he'd felt the need to lie so extensively. He'd confessed everything to his family, his other friends. He'd lost his job because he'd been falsifying work credentials too. His entire life had imploded, and he was trying to rebuild from scratch, this time with honesty. He apologized for lying to me, said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, but he wanted me to know that underneath all the lies, his friendship with me had been real. The emotions, the connection, the care he had for me, that wasn't fake. I wanted to believe him, but I didn't know if I could trust anything he said anymore. How do you rebuild trust with someone who's proven they can lie convincingly for decades? How do you know when they're finally being honest? We met for coffee a few times. Tom was different, quieter, more uncertain. Without the elaborate stories and fake confidence, he seemed smaller somehow. He told me about his real life. The ordinary job, the small apartment, the lack of exciting adventures. He was just a regular person who'd made some bad choices and let them spiral out of control. I realized that the person I'd been friends with for 20 years was partly real and partly fiction. The real Tom existed somewhere underneath all the lies, but I'd never fully known him. I'd been friends with a character he'd created, a persona he'd maintained for my benefit. It's been 2 years now, and Tom and I still talk occasionally. But it's not the same. We're not best friends anymore. Too much damage was done. Too much trust was broken. I can't fully relax around him because I'm always wondering if he's telling the truth or if he's slipped back into old patterns. Tom says he's better now, that he's living honestly, that he's accepted his life for what it is. I hope that's true. I hope he's learned from what happened and is building a better foundation this time around. But I'll never know for certain. That's the thing about trust once it's broken. You can rebuild it, but it's never quite as strong as it was before. The experience taught me something important about friendship. It's not just about shared history or fun memories. It's about honesty and authenticity. You have to be able to be yourself with your friends, and they have to be able to be themselves with you. When that foundation doesn't exist, when one person is performing a role instead of being genuine, it's not really friendship. It's something else. I also learned that people lie for complicated reasons. Tom wasn't trying to hurt me by lying. He was trying to protect himself from feeling inadequate. His lies came from insecurity and fear, not malice. That doesn't make them okay, but it provides context. Everyone presents a curated version of themselves to the world. We emphasize our successes and downplay our failures. We show our best angles and hide our worst. That's normal human behavior. But there's a line between putting your best foot forward and completely fabricating your life. Tom crossed that line and couldn't find his way back. I sometimes wonder how many people are living similar lies. How many of my acquaintances are presenting carefully constructed personas that don't match their reality? How many Toms are out there, trapped in webs of their own making, too afraid to tell the truth? Social media has made this easier and harder at the same time. Easier because you can create whatever image you want with carefully selected photos and status updates. Harder because maintaining that image across multiple platforms, keeping your story consistent, making sure no one discovers the truth, it's exhausting. Tom spent over 20 years maintaining his elaborate lie, 20 years of constant vigilance, of remembering which story he'd told to which person, of creating supporting evidence for his fabrications. I can't imagine living that way. The stress alone would be overwhelming. When everything fell apart, Tom actually seemed relieved, like he'd been carrying an enormous weight and finally got to put it down. Even though his life was objectively worse after the truth came out, he was happier because he didn't have to maintain the lie anymore. That might be the saddest part of the whole story. Tom had imprisoned himself with his own lies. The person who suffered most from his deception was him. He'd isolated himself from genuine connection because no one could know the real him. He'd created a life that looked good on the outside but was hollow on the inside. I think about our friendship sometimes, about the conversations we had, the experiences we shared. Some of that was real. The time we spent together as kids, the memories we made before he started lying, those are genuine. But so much of our adult friendship was built on false premises that I can't trust any of it fully. Maybe Tom is living honestly now. Maybe he's learned his lesson and built a better life. I hope so, not because we're close anymore, but because no one deserves to live the way he was living. Constantly afraid of being discovered, constantly maintaining a fiction, never able to fully relax or be himself. Friendship should be a safe space where you can be authentic, where you don't have to pretend or perform. Tom never gave himself that safety, and in doing so, he destroyed the genuine friendship we could have had. That story about Tom really makes you think about how well we really know the people in our lives. We trust what people tell us because questioning everything would be exhausting. But sometimes that trust is misplaced. Sometimes the person we think we know is largely fiction. Let's talk about something different now. This next story is about a family secret that changed how someone saw their entire childhood. I'm 45 years old, and last year I discovered that my father had another family, not in the past, right now. While he was married to my mother, while he was supposedly working long hours to support us, he had an entirely separate life with another woman and their 2 children. My father, Richard, was always a workaholic. He travelled constantly for business, or so we thought. He'd be gone for weeks at a time, calling home occasionally to check in, but always sounding rushed and busy. My mother never questioned it because he made good money, and his career required extensive travel, or that's what he told us. I found out the truth by accident. I was at a conference in a city where my father had supposedly never been. During a break, I decided to grab lunch at a nearby restaurant. And there he was, sitting at a table with a woman and 2 teenagers, laughing like they were a normal family having a regular meal together. My first thought was that it must be colleagues or clients. But the way he was looking at them, the ease and familiarity of their interactions, it didn't fit. Then the woman leaned over and kissed him. Not a friendly peck. A kiss that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I left the restaurant before he could see me, went back to my hotel room and tried to process what I'd witnessed. There had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd separated and my mother hadn't told me. Maybe this was a new relationship and the kids were hers from a previous marriage. But deep down, I knew. The way he'd looked so comfortable, so at home with them. This wasn't new. This had been going on for a while. I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds extreme, but I needed to know the full truth before I confronted my father or told my mother. The investigator worked quickly. Within 2 weeks, I had a comprehensive report that laid out my father's double life in disturbing detail. He'd been married to this other woman, Diane, for 18 years. They had 2 children together, a boy aged 16 and a girl aged 14. He lived with them half the time, splitting his schedule between 2 families in different cities. The business trips he'd been taking my entire adult life, half of them were real. The other half were him going back to his other family. He had 2 houses, 2 sets of furniture, 2 complete lives. He attended parent-teacher conferences at 2 different schools. He celebrated holidays twice, once with each family. He maintained separate social media accounts, separate friend groups, separate everything. The investigator couldn't determine if Diane knew about us or if she thought she had his full attention when he was with her. But either way, my father had been living this double life for nearly 2 decades, and no one had caught him until now. I confronted him first. I invited him to lunch, showed him the investigator's report, and watched his face go pale. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, come up with some explanation. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the photos and documents, his carefully constructed life crumbling around him. He admitted everything. He'd met Diane at a work conference 20 years ago. They'd had an affair, and she'd gotten pregnant. Instead of confessing to my mother and ending our family, he'd made a choice. He'd married Diane, set her up in another city, and divided his time between both families. He'd been able to pull it off because he was self-employed and controlled his own schedule, because both cities were within driving distance of each other, because he was meticulous about keeping his 2 lives separate, and because both my mother and Diane trusted him completely. I asked him why. Why not just get a divorce? Why not choose one family over the other? His answer made me sick. He said he loved both families. He couldn't bear to leave either of us. So he decided to keep both, even if it meant living a lie. He actually seemed to think this was noble somehow, like he'd made a sacrifice to keep everyone happy. He didn't seem to understand that what he'd really done was betray everyone who trusted him. He denied both families the truth, denied us the chance to make informed decisions about our own lives. Telling my mother was the hardest conversation I've ever had. She was in her early 60s, had been married to my father for over 40 years. Their entire marriage had been built on lies. She'd trusted him completely, never questioned his absences, never suspected that he was living a whole other life while pretending to love only her. She was devastated, not just by the infidelity, but by the scope and duration of the deception. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a brief affair. This was a systematic, deliberate choice to deceive her for decades. Every time he'd said he loved her, every anniversary they'd celebrated, every family dinner where he'd sat at the head of the table, he'd been lying. My mother filed for divorce immediately. 40 years of marriage ended because my father couldn't be honest about what he wanted, couldn't face the difficult conversation, couldn't deal with the consequences of his choices. So he tried to have everything and ended up losing it all. I don't know what happened with Diane and her family, whether he told her about us or if she found out some other way. I assume his life in that city fell apart the same way it did in ours. You can't maintain a lie that big forever. Eventually, it catches up with you. My father tried to reach out to me several times after everything came out. He wanted to explain, wanted me to understand his perspective, but I had nothing to say to him. He'd lied to me my entire life. Every birthday he attended, every graduation, every important moment, he'd been splitting his attention between 2 families. I was never his priority. None of us were. His priority was maintaining the lie. The experience made me re-evaluate my entire childhood. Every memory I had was now coloured by this knowledge. When he missed my school plays or sporting events because of work trips, was he actually with his other family? When he seemed distracted during family dinners, was he thinking about them? How many times had he chosen them over us without us even knowing? And the lies he must have told, thousands of them, over decades. Lies about where he was, what he was doing, who he was with. Lies to my mother's face every single day. Lies to me, to my siblings, to everyone who trusted him. He'd lived in a constant state of deception for 20 years and somehow managed to seem normal, reliable, trustworthy. That's what scares me most. How good he was at lying. How completely he fooled everyone who loved him. It makes me wonder who else in my life might be lying with the same skill and dedication. How would I know? If my own father could deceive me so thoroughly, what chance do I have of seeing through anyone else's lies? My mother is doing better now. It's been over a year since the divorce was finalized. She's in therapy, working through the betrayal and trying to rebuild her sense of self. She's dating someone new, which seems healthy, someone who's honest and present and not living a secret double life. My siblings and I are still processing everything. We've all cut contact with our father. He made his choice when he decided to lie to us for decades. He can live with the consequences. Sometimes I wonder about his other family, about those kids who also found out their father had been lying to them their whole lives. They didn't ask to be part of this mess any more than I did. Our father's selfishness hurt everyone involved. The whole situation taught me something important about trust and honesty. It's not enough to love someone. You also have to be truthful with them. My father probably did love both his families in some twisted way, but that love was poisoned by his constant lying. Real love requires honesty, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He could have ended his marriage to my mother when he met Diane. It would have been painful, but it would have been honest. Instead, he chose the coward's path. He tried to avoid the difficult conversation and ended up creating a situation that was infinitely worse for everyone involved. The betrayal of trust is what hurts most. Not the fact that he had another family, though that's shocking enough, but that he looked me in the eye for 20 years and lied. That he attended my wedding and met my children while hiding this massive secret. That he played the role of devoted father and husband while simultaneously playing the exact same role in another city with another family. How do you come back from that? How do you ever trust anyone completely after learning that the person you trusted most was living a lie? I'm still working through that question in therapy. Still trying to figure out how to maintain healthy relationships when I'm constantly looking for signs of deception. My father destroyed his own family because he didn't have the courage to be honest. That's his legacy now. Not the successful career or the family moments he was present for, just the lie. The massive, elaborate, decades-long lie that hurt everyone who loved him. I hope he thinks it was worth it. These stories about deception, about people living double lives, they're more common than you'd think. Not to this extent, maybe. But the core idea of showing one face to the world while hiding something completely different that happens all the time. We're coming to the end of our time together tonight, but I want to share one more story. This one is about someone who made peace with their past in an unexpected way. I'm 51 years old, and 5 years ago I went back to my hometown for the first time in 30 years. I'd left when I was 18, right after high school graduation, and never looked back. I had my reasons. The place held too many painful memories, too much hurt. I'd built a new life in a new city, and never saw a reason to return. But my mother died. She'd been the one person from my old life I'd stayed in touch with, the one connection I'd maintained. And her funeral meant going back to the place I'd spent 3 decades avoiding. The town had changed less than I expected. The main street looked almost identical to how I remembered it. The same stores, the same layout, even some of the same people. It was like stepping back in time. I'd left because of my father. He was an alcoholic, violent and unpredictable. He'd made my childhood a nightmare of fear and uncertainty. I never knew which version of him I'd get. The sober dad who could be kind and funny, or the drunk dad who broke things and screamed and hit. My mother had stayed with him, made excuses for him, tried to keep the family together despite everything. When I turned 18, I left. I moved across the country, built a new life, tried to forget where I came from. My mother and I stayed in touch through letters and occasional phone calls, but I never went back. Not for holidays, not for family emergencies, not for anything. The pain of that place was too much. My father had died 10 years before my mother. She'd called to tell me, asked if I wanted to attend the funeral. I'd said no. I felt nothing about his death except relief that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. She'd been disappointed but understood. Now she was gone too, and I had to face the place I'd run from all those years ago. The funeral was small. My mother had outlived most of her friends and siblings. The people who came were mostly from her church, people I didn't know. I felt like a stranger at my own mother's funeral. After the service, an elderly man approached me. He introduced himself as Jim, said he'd been my father's sponsor in AA. I was confused. My father had never been to AA as far as I knew. He'd died an alcoholic, still drinking, still making everyone around him miserable. Jim asked if we could talk privately. We went to a nearby coffee shop, and he told me a story I'd never heard, about how my father had gotten sober 5 years before he died. How he'd joined AA, worked the steps, tried to make amends for the damage he'd done, how he'd wanted to reach out to me, but my mother had said I wanted nothing to do with him. He said my father had carried tremendous guilt about how he'd treated our family, that getting sober meant facing what he'd done without the buffer of alcohol to numb the shame. He'd spent his last years trying to be a better person, helping other alcoholics, working to repair what he could of the relationships he'd destroyed. My mother had apparently been part of his recovery. She'd forgiven him, supported his sobriety, even renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony a few years before he died. Jim said those last years had been good ones for both of them, that my father had become the man she'd always hoped he could be. I didn't know how to process this information. I'd spent 30 years hating my father, glad he was out of my life, certain he'd died miserable and alone as he deserved. Learning that he'd changed, that he'd found peace and redemption, it didn't fit the narrative I'd built. Jim gave me a letter. He said my father had written it years ago, asked Jim to give it to me if I ever came back. It had been sitting in Jim's desk drawer, waiting. I couldn't read it right away. I took it back to my hotel room, stared at it for hours. Part of me wanted to tear it up without reading it. What could he possibly say that would matter now? He'd made my childhood hell. He'd given me trauma that I'd spent decades working through in therapy. An apology couldn't undo that damage. But eventually, curiosity won. I opened the letter and read my father's words from beyond the grave. He apologized, not with excuses or justifications, but a real apology acknowledging what he'd done and the pain he'd caused. He wrote about his own childhood, his own trauma, the reasons he'd turned to alcohol in the first place, not to excuse his behavior, but to provide context. He wrote about getting sober, about the work it had taken to face what he'd done without the shield of addiction, about wanting to reach out to me but respecting my mother's judgment that I needed distance, about hoping that someday I might be able to forgive him, not for his sake, but for mine. He wrote that he understood if I never forgave him, that he'd made choices that had lasting consequences, and he had to live with that. But he wanted me to know that he'd tried, in his final years, to be better, to break the cycle of hurt and anger, and he hoped that I could do the same, could build a life free from the damage he'd inflicted. The letter wasn't what I expected. There was no self-pity, no asking for sympathy, just a man acknowledging his failures and hoping his son could move past them. I spent the rest of my time in my hometown thinking about that letter, walking through places I'd avoided for decades, seeing them with new eyes, the house where I'd grown up, now occupied by strangers, the school where I'd spent my teenage years counting down the days until I could leave, the park where I'd hidden when things got bad at home. These places didn't have the same power over me anymore. The fear and anger I'd felt for so long started to feel more distant, like emotions that belonged to someone else. My father was gone. My mother was gone. The painful past was just that past. I realized that by holding on to my hatred for my father, I'd been giving him power over me even after his death. I'd organized my entire adult life around avoiding him and the place where he'd hurt me. I'd let his actions define me, let his mistakes shape my choices. Reading that letter, learning about his recovery, it didn't erase what he'd done. The abuse was real. The trauma was real. But it allowed me to see him as a complete person, not just the monster from my childhood. He'd been broken and hurting, made terrible choices, and eventually tried to make amends. I'll never know if his change was genuine, or if it would have lasted. Death cut short whatever redemption arc he was working toward. But knowing he tried, knowing he acknowledged what he'd done, it gave me something I didn't know I needed. Closure. I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I deserved to stop carrying around all that anger and hurt. It was heavy, and I'd been carrying it for far too long. Forgiving him didn't mean forgetting what happened, or pretending our relationship was something it wasn't. It meant accepting that he was human, flawed and damaged, doing his best with limited tools and too much pain. It meant recognizing that holding on to hatred wasn't protecting me anymore, just weighing me down. I left my hometown after my mother's funeral feeling different, lighter somehow. I'd faced the place I'd run from and discovered it had no power over me anymore. The scared 18-year-old who'd fled was gone. In his place was a 51-year-old man who'd built a good life despite his painful start. My father gave me a lot of things, most of them unwanted. Trauma, fear, a deep distrust of alcohol, and people who drink. But in his last years, unknowingly, he gave me one final gift. A letter that helped me let go of the past and move forward with less baggage. I still think about him sometimes. Wonder what he was like in those final sober years. Whether he found peace with himself, or if he spent every day fighting the urge to drink and the weight of his regrets. I'll never know, but I hope he found some measure of peace, because if he did, maybe that means redemption is possible for anyone. Maybe we all get a chance to be better than our worst moments. That's not a happy ending exactly. My father didn't live long enough to rebuild our relationship. I don't have warm memories of him as a sober, kind man. I only have that letter and Jim's stories about someone I never really knew. But it's enough. It's a kind of closure I didn't expect to get, and it freed me from a burden I didn't realize I could put down. I've returned to my hometown a few times since then. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. It's just a place now, not a prison of painful memories. I've reconnected with a few people from my past, people who knew me before I left. It's strange sometimes, bridging the gap between who I was then and who I am now. But mostly, I'm grateful. Grateful that my father found sobriety, even if it was late. Grateful that my mother got to spend some happy years with him before she died. Grateful that I got that letter and the chance to forgive someone who's no longer around to receive the forgiveness. Life is complicated. People are complicated. We're all carrying around damage and trying our best to not pass it on to others. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes we fail spectacularly. But maybe the trying matters. Maybe the effort to be better, even when it's late, even when it can't undo the harm already done, maybe that counts for something. I don't have all the answers. I'm still working through a lot of what happened in my childhood, still dealing with the long-term effects of growing up in an unstable, frightening environment. But I'm not defined by it anymore. I'm not the sum of my father's mistakes or my painful past. I'm just a person trying to live well, to be kind, to break the cycles of hurt that could so easily perpetuate. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do. So that's it for tonight. Multiple stories about deception, about secrets, about redemption and revenge, and the complicated choices people make. About trust broken and sometimes rebuilt. About the ways we hurt each other and occasionally, rarely, find ways to heal. Life isn't simple. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from, they're often incomplete or based on information that turns out to be wrong. We do our best with what we know, and we adjust as new information comes to light. The common thread through all these stories is that truth matters, not because it's always comfortable or welcome, but because living with lies, either our own or other people's, eventually becomes unbearable. The truth might hurt when it first comes out, but lies hurt more in the long run. Whether it's Marcus living a double life, the family keeping an adoption secret, Tom creating an elaborate fake persona, or a father living two separate families, the lies eventually collapse under their own weight, and when they do, they leave destruction in their wake. But there's also hope in these stories. Emma rebuilt her life with help from a stranger. The person who discovered their adoption eventually found a way to build new relationships based on truth. The son who lost his father's business to betrayal created something better, and I found peace with a past I'd spent decades running from. We're all just trying to figure it out. Trying to navigate relationships, trust the right people, build lives we're proud of. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail, sometimes we hurt people we care about, intentionally or otherwise, and sometimes we're the ones who get hurt. But we keep going. We learn from our mistakes, from other people's mistakes. We try to be better tomorrow than we were today, and maybe that's all we can really ask of ourselves or anyone else. If you're going through something difficult right now, if you're dealing with betrayal or lies or painful truths, I hope these stories helped in some small way. I hope they reminded you that you're not alone in struggling with complicated situations, that other people have faced similar challenges and found ways through them. Take care of yourself. Be honest with the people you love. Pay attention to the small kindnesses you can offer to strangers. Forgive when you can, but also recognize when forgiveness isn't possible or healthy, And remember that your story is still being written. Whatever difficult chapter you're in right now, it's not the end. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight. Whether you're falling asleep to this, using it to escape from a hard day, or just listening while you do other things, I appreciate you being here. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.